have a pretty big question to begin with, and is what is your vision of capitalism?
Well, my vision of capitalism includes an important role for market competition. I think, our capitalist system in the United States has been responsible for driving so much innovation and growth. But a key ingredient there has been making sure that upstarts and innovators and people with a good idea can get a fair shake. And if you're undertaking certain risks, be able to reap the rewards of that risk if your product or service is succeeding. And so I think that's a critical component here and why antitrust and anti-monopoly has been such an ingredient.
So imagine that I am a factory worker in Ohio, and I ask you, how did your tenure at the FTC change my life?
So it's a really important question, and actually a question that I kept top of mind during my entire tenure. In healthcare, we were especially active in taking on basically the illegal tactics that inflate drug prices. And so, because of the FTC's work, for example, asthma inhalers today cost less than they did 5 years ago, where asthma inhalers have been around for decades, but through various patenting tricks, the dominant manufacturers were keeping out generics from the market. And after we challenged those tactics, three of the four big manufacturers said they were going to drop the out of pocket cost from hundreds of dollars down to $35. The FTC's work has also made it easier to repair your own product. Through a whole series of lawsuits, we took on the illegal repair restrictions that mean that farmers can't easily fix their own tractors, or people can't easily take their phone to an independent repair shop and instead have to go to the manufacturer. This was an area where we had not seen much enforcement for many, many years, even as companies were switching more to services, and so therefore benefiting from repair being an increasing form of source of profitability. The FTC's work on labor markets was extraordinarily significant. I mean, we finalized a rule that would ban non-compete clauses. That is now being litigated, but the FTC's lawsuits already resulted in non-competes being dropped for thousands upon thousands of workers. We stopped major mergers that would have reduced competition in areas like grocery retail. The Kroger Albertsons merger, for example, would have been the biggest grocery merger in US history. The FTC successfully blocked that. We successfully blocked over half a dozen hospital mergers that would have resulted in various parts of the country paying more for hospital services, even as quality went down. And so I would say the agency really punched above its weight, given what a small institution we are, and really achieved win after win for the American people.
As I was reading up before this, I thought, everybody says they're pro-competition. You say you are, your foes say that they're pro-competition. And I thought there was a very ironic note in this idea that your effort to ban non-competes is somehow anti-competitive, which got me thinking about the way in which people use words. Silicon Valley, for instance, would say that they are very pro-competition. And yet you wrote in a recent op-ed that these companies have been arguing that the government must protect them from competition to ensure that America stays ahead. So how do you think about that, the use of that word competition, and how do you think different people mean it?
Well, non-competes are literally called non-competes. And so I think there's something slightly self-evident going on there. I think people are probably most familiar with the idea of competition from sports, right? When you're playing a game, there are certain set of rules, but within the confines of the rules, you're trying to win. You're trying to kind of beat the other team or the other person. And what we've seen is that through certain business tactics, firms can actually try to squash the competition or shut out the competition. And so get ahead, not by doing better, but instead by what you might in the sports context call cheating, right? Injuring the other player, trying to rig the level, the playing field in some way. And so, making sure you're really promoting fair competition, fair dealing is what antitrust is about.
What do you make of the off voice throughout history argument that antitrust regulators should be hands off because we need to see America succeed? And you wrote this in a recent op-ed that tech companies have been arguing that the government must protect them from competition to ensure that America stays ahead. And even Mark Cuban said a version of that, which is that breaking up big tech companies might put the US at a disadvantage. So should that argument that America's well-being is at stake affect what an antitrust regulator does, that there's a bigger picture here, or should it not? And is it used often to deflect attention from the real issue, or is it used in good faith?
Yeah, I mean, I won't opine on kind of what are the motives of the people making these arguments, though oftentimes they are coming from the subjects of antitrust enforcement. And it's true, this argument goes back decades. I mean, when the Justice Department was initially preparing a lawsuit against AT&T back in the 1950s, we saw, them encourage the Defense Department to weigh in on how acting against AT&T could undermine the United States' national security. And so we've seen versions of those arguments made. I mean, I think what we've also seen is that a key driver of America's innovative spirit and a competitive edge internationally has been the fact that we are not just coddling our incumbents, and we are allowing kind of new upstarts and innovators to also get out ahead. And I think a system where you're instead allowing more effectively central planning by a handful of monopolists rather than forcing those monopolists to also look over their shoulder and make sure that they're increasing their speed if there are upstarts behind them. I think that there are real downsides there, and we've seen that economies that instead double down on the national champions approach, including Japan in certain instances, actually fell behind, whereas the US taking action against Microsoft, for example, ended up being really important in making sure that the market was open and that the upstarts, including Google and Facebook and Amazon, were able to actually scale rather than get squashed in the crib by Microsoft. I think the national security argument in the context of big tech is really fascinating, given just look at some of the entanglements and dependencies that these firms have, including in China. And I think we've been seeing more revelations, including recently from a whistleblower who had been at Facebook, about the types of accommodations that these firms have tried to make, especially to China, because of their market incentives. And so I think we should be very leery of assuming that, these companies are kind of patriots first rather than kind of profit maximizing, kind of shareholder responsive entities that are going to put their business interests first, even when that means kind of cozying up to nations that may not have their interests aligned with the United States.
So your fellows simultaneously point out that that the FTC lost a lot of the cases that you brought, but also that you single-handedly destroyed the American merger economy and destroyed capitalism. So talk us through how both those things can be true, or if you would refute either one of them.
Yeah, I think some of the critiques have at various points been pretty divorced from reality. And, when I came in, it was true that for decades, the antitrust agencies had taken a more hands-off approach to market consolidation and to mergers and acquisitions. Take the tech industry, where we saw the big five tech companies make over 800 acquisitions over the period of a decade, with not a single one being blocked and just a handful even being closely scrutinized. In areas like healthcare, we have seen a huge surge in consolidation with higher costs and worse service as a result. Take an area like rental cars, where we now have three major players. Oftentimes there can be an illusion of choice because when you go to the airport, you'll see 6 or 7 brands, but those brands are actually just controlled by 3 companies. And when the FTC was reviewing one of those mergers, they decided, yes, there were problems, but they would allow it to go through as long as some of the assets would be divested to another company. that other company ended up going bankrupt, and the original merging companies ended up buying back those assets at a lower price. So the remedies that the agencies had been pursuing in some instances had failed catastrophically. And practically, this meant that in people's day to day lives, they had fewer choices, they were paying higher prices, workers had fewer employment options, and their wages were suffering as a result. And overall, our markets were more centralized and less open and competitive in ways that really do encourage entrepreneurship and startup and business dynamism. And so we decided that we were going to be much more skeptical, especially in the context of huge deals that would dramatically consolidate a market, and that we were going to be much more leery of remedies if they weren't actually going to fix the problem. And in both of those instances, we saw real results. We filed major lawsuits. We had a win rate that was over 95%. And most importantly, we created deterrence in the marketplace. I mean, one of the things that was most shocking to me was hearing from antitrust lawyers and senior deal makers that before the Biden administration, as they were contemplating deals, antitrust risk would not be talked about at all. And if it were, it would come up at the very end once the main factors had already been worked out. And if I'm a law enforcer, I want to make sure firms are staying on the right side of the law. And they should be figuring out right away if a deal that they're contemplating is illegal. And if so, they shouldn't pursue it. And so the idea that firms, as a result of the FTC's vigorous approach, were having to start thinking about the legal risk on day one rather than months down the line was a real positive.
So when I hear your answer to my previous question and to Bethany's questions, I feel that there is a lot that can reach ordinary human beings. So if I were a consultant for Kamala Harris, I would say you should run on the record of Lina Khan at the FTC, because after all, I'm sorry to say, the Biden administration did not have a lot of victories to run on, or at least on the popular front. And especially with the slogan Kamala for the people, you will expect that your agenda will become at the center of the campaign. But maybe I miss it. I didn't hear a squeak about that. If anything, there was some squeak of some of our founders who wanted to fire you. So why is that the case? And more importantly, is there a future for an antitrust agenda in the Democratic platform?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a campaign strategist or a political operative, so I can't speak to the, specific decisions that campaigns made. But as a general matter, I think what we are seeing right now under the Trump administration is a huge set of concerns about concentrated economic power, about oligarchy. You have huge rallies being led by Senator Sanders and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez around the country, where you have tens of thousands of people coming out really upset and angry about the deep concentration of economic power, which sits upstream from so many challenges that we face in our day-to-day lives. So there are a lot of open questions about what the future is going to look like, what the future of the Democratic Party is going to look like. But at a grassroots level, I think we see enormous hunger from people for elected officials and for government to stand up for them, especially when it means taking on law-breaking corporations that on a day-to-day level are making their life worse off.
You had argued that, I think you've argued that Trump's firing of Democratic FTC commissioners is a sign of Trump protecting billionaire donors. And yet there's the Google case and the Meta case. Andrew Ferguson, your successor, has said that he was going to reverse Lina Khan's anti-business agenda and stop Lina Khan's war on mergers. And yet, do you see any common ground, or do you think what is happening now is a complete reversal of the policies of what you had accomplished? And then how much of your work can be undone?
So I think on the antitrust side, we've actually seen a striking degree of continuity. The Trump administration has agreed to keep in place the merger guidelines that we put in place at the end of 2023. They have kept in place the new Hart-Scott-Rodino form that we introduced, which is kind of in the weeds, but it's basically the form that companies have to fill out and the information they have to submit when they are pursuing a reportable transaction. We had introduced a form that was basically a game changer. Private equity in particular was very upset about it, but they've kept that in place. They are continuing with many of the lawsuits. The trial against Facebook, we're now in its second week. I think on the consumer protection side, because that's work FTC does as well, we have seen a major slowdown